The deafening crack of a gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Redemption Creek, Montana, in 1876. But it wasn't the bullet that killed Tabitha Lawson's reputation, it was the whispers that followed. The townsfolk called her many things: scarlet woman, harlot, fallen dove. They didn't bother to lower their voices as she passed, her chin held high despite the weight of their judgment pressing down on her slender shoulders. Tabitha pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she hurried down the wooden boardwalk. The autumn wind carried whispers that stung worse than the cold. "There she goes," Mrs. Holloway hissed to the milliner beside her, "the banker's daughter who spread her legs for that traveling salesman. Now she's soiled goods." Tabitha kept walking, her boots clicking against the wooden planks. 6 months had passed since the scandal, but in a town like Redemption Creek, memories were longer than the Montana winter. The general store bell jingled as she entered. Mr. Simmons, the proprietor, watched her with narrowed eyes as she placed her list on the counter. "Just the essentials today, Mr. Simmons," Tabitha said softly. "Payment up front," he replied coldly, not bothering to hide his disdain. Tabitha counted out the coins from her dwindling savings. Her father had disowned her, casting her out of their grand home on the hill. Now she lived in a small cabin on the edge of town, taking in mending to survive. The past 6 months had been a lesson in cruelty and resilience. "Your merchandise," Mr. Simmons said, sliding the parcels toward her without meeting her eyes. As Tabitha gathered her purchases, the store door swung open. The man who entered seemed to bring the wilderness with him, tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered by sun and wind. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, and his eyes, startlingly blue beneath the brim of his Stetson, surveyed the store with quiet alertness. Mr. Simmons immediately straightened. Preston Grayson, didn't expect to see you back in these parts." The stranger. Preston nodded politely. "Just passing through, Mr. Simmons. Need supplies before heading back to the ranch." Tabitha kept her head down, gathering her parcels. She didn't need another encounter with someone who would judge her. As she turned to leave, she bumped into Preston's solid frame. Her parcels tumbled to the floor. "I'm so sorry, madam," Preston said, immediately crouching to help her. Their fingers brushed as they both reached for a tin of coffee. Tabitha jerked back as if burned. When she looked up, those blue eyes were studying her with curiosity, not condemnation. "No harm done," she murmured. Mr. Simmons cleared his throat. "Preston, don't waste your time with that one. She's ready to be on my way," Tabitha interrupted, clutching her recovered parcels to her chest. "Good day, gentlemen." She hurried out of the store, feeling the cowboy's eyes on her back. Outside, Tabitha took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air, steadying herself. "Miss, wait." Tabitha turned to see Preston Grayson jogging after her, holding a small package. "You forgot this," he said, extending a parcel of sugar. "Thank you," she said, taking it carefully to avoid touching his hand again. "Preston Grayson," he introduced himself with a tip of his hat. "Just got back to these parts after 2 years driving cattle up from Texas." "Tabitha Lawson," she replied, surprised he didn't already know who she was or what they said about her. Preston smiled, revealing a dimple in his left cheek. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Lawson." "It's just Tabitha now," she corrected him, her voice tight. "Good day, Mr. Grayson." She turned away, aware of his puzzled expression. It was better this way. The moment he learned of her past, that polite smile would vanish, replaced by the familiar look of disgust she'd grown accustomed to seeing. The next day, Tabitha was hanging laundry behind her small cabin when the sound of hoofbeats made her pause. Preston Grayson rode up on a magnificent chestnut gelding. "Miss Lawson," he called, dismounting with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. "Mr. Grayson," she acknowledged, wary. "What brings you here?" "Heard you do mending," he said, reaching into his saddlebag. "Got some shirts that have seen better days." She eyed the bundle of fabric he held out. "Who told you?" "Mrs. Kincaid at the boarding house said you were the best seamstress in the county." Tabitha was surprised. Mrs. Kincaid rarely had a kind word for her these days. "Did she mention anything else about me?" Preston's expression remained open. "Just that you lived out this way. Should she have?" Tabitha took the bundle, careful not to let their hands touch. 3 cents per patch, 5 for complicated tears. I'll have them ready by Thursday." He nodded, making no move to leave. "Nice place you got here." Tabitha glanced at her tiny cabin with its patched roof and crooked porch. It was a far cry from the mansion on the hill where she'd grown up. "It serves its purpose," she said stiffly. Preston removed his hat, revealing thick, dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "I don't mean to pry, but you seem fallen." The word escaped before she could stop it. His brow furrowed. "I was going to say, alone." The unexpected gentleness in his voice made her chest tighten. "I am alone, Mr. Grayson, by choice and by circumstance." "Preston," he corrected, "and nobody should be alone in these parts. Winter's coming." "I can manage," she said, raising her chin. "I've been managing just fine." Preston studied her for a long moment. "I reckon you have." He placed his hat back on his head. "Thursday. Then." As he mounted his horse, Tabitha found herself asking, "Where are you staying?" "Got a small ranch about 5 miles west. My uncle left it to me. Been away driving cattle to save up enough to make something of it." "Good luck with that," she said, meaning it. His smile flashed again, warm as the summer sun. "Thank you, Tabitha." She watched him ride away, his straight back silhouetted against the golden afternoon light. For the first time in months, she felt something other than shame or anger, a tiny flicker of curiosity about this man who looked at her without judgment. That evening, as Tabitha worked on Preston's shirts by lamplight, there was a sharp knock at her door. Her heart quickened. No one visited her after sundown. She opened the door to find Sheriff Wilson, his weathered face grim beneath his silver mustache. "Evening, Miss Lawson. Got a complaint about you." Tabitha's stomach clenched. "A complaint?" "Mrs. Holloway saw that Grayson fellow visiting. Says you're plying your trade again." The sheriff had the decency to look uncomfortable. "You know how folks talk." Heat flooded Tabitha's face. "He brought shirts for mending, nothing more." Sheriff Wilson sighed. "Look, girl, I knew your daddy. For his sake, I'm just giving you friendly advice. Be careful who you associate with. Town's got a long memory." "My father disowned me, Sheriff," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "And I'm not what they say I am. I never was." The sheriff studied her, then nodded slightly. "Just be careful. That's all I'm saying." After he left, Tabitha sank to the floor, pressing her hands against her burning cheeks. One mistake, one moment of weakness with a man who'd promised her the world only to disappear come morning, and she'd lost everything. Her family, her reputation, her future. And now, Preston Grayson's simple kindness threatened to make things worse. When Thursday arrived, Tabitha had Preston's shirts ready, neatly folded with each tier meticulously repaired. She expected him to send a ranch hand for them, not wanting to risk his reputation by associating with her again. Instead, Mid-afternoon brought the sound of his horse approaching. This time, he carried a small crate. "Thought you might like some fresh eggs," he said, setting the crate on her porch. "My hens are laying more than I can eat." Tabitha stared at the eggs, then at Preston. "Why are you being kind to me?" The directness of her question seemed to surprise him. He removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "Should I have a reason beyond common decency?" "In this town?" "Yes." She handed him his mended shirts. "That'll be 27 cents. He paid her, their fingers brushing during the exchange. This time, she didn't pull away quite so quickly. "Someone's been talking to you," she said, noticing the thoughtful expression on his face. Preston nodded slowly. "Stopped for a drink at the saloon last night. Barkeep was mighty talkative." Tabitha's throat tightened. "I see. Well, now you know what kind of woman I am." "Do I?" Preston's gaze was steady. "All I know is what a bunch of gossips say about a woman who seems to be surviving all on her own, with dignity, despite being treated worse than a leper." His words stunned her into silence. "The way I see it," he continued, "this town's full of hypocrites. The men who visit Madame Josie's establishment on Saturday nights are the same ones pointing fingers at you on Sunday mornings." "It's different for men," Tabitha said bitterly. "It shouldn't be." A gust of wind swept around them, bringing the scent of pine and approaching snow. Tabitha shivered. "Your woodpile's looking low," Preston observed, glancing toward the side of her cabin. "I'll manage." Preston settled his hat back on his head. "I'm sure you will. But if you change your mind, I've got plenty of seasoned oak that needs splitting. Could use a hand at the ranch now and then, too, paying work." "Mr. Grayson." "Preston." "Preston," she amended. "You shouldn't get involved with me. Your reputation, my reputation." He laughed, a rich, genuine sound that warmed something inside her. "Miss Lawson, I've spent 2 years sleeping under the stars, eating trail dust, and driving ornery cattle across half the country. I reckon my reputation can survive helping out a neighbor." "We're not neighbors. We're 5 miles apart," he interrupted. "That's practically next door in these parts." Before she could respond, he tipped his hat. "Think about it. Winter's coming, and those shirts won't keep food on your table." With that, he mounted his horse and rode away. Tabitha watched until he disappeared over the ridge, then looked down at the eggs he'd brought a simple kindness that felt more valuable than gold. The first snowfall came early that year, blanketing Redemption Creek in white silence. Tabitha's meager savings had dwindled, and the mending work had slowed as winter approached. Pride had kept her from accepting Preston's offer of work, but hunger was a powerful motivator. The 5-mile journey to his ranch took her nearly 2 hours through the snow. His property came into view as she crested a hill, a modest spread with a sturdy log house, barn, and corral where several horses stomped in the cold. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth within. Tabitha hesitated at the gate, her courage faltering. What if he'd only made the offer out of pity? What if he'd changed his mind? Before she could turn back, the front door opened. Preston stood framed in the doorway, surprise evident on his face. "Tabitha, you're half frozen." He hurried down the steps, concern etched in his features. "Come inside before you catch your death." The interior of the ranch house was simple but comfortable, a large main room with a stone fireplace, sturdy wooden furniture, and surprisingly neat for a bachelor's dwelling. "Sit by the fire," Preston urged, helping her remove her snow-dusted coat. "I'll make coffee." As warmth returned to her limbs, Tabitha found her voice. "You said you needed help. I'm here to work." Preston set a steaming mug before her. "What about your mending?" "Not enough of it," she admitted. "The town's turned elsewhere." Understanding darkened his eyes. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I've made my peace with it." She straightened her spine. "Now, what needs doing?" Over the next few weeks, a routine developed. 3 days a week, weather permitting, Tabitha rode to Preston's ranch on an old mare he'd lent her. She cooked, cleaned, mended, and helped with the indoor chores while Preston worked outside with his 2 ranch hands, Miguel and Caleb. The ranch became a sanctuary, a place where no one whispered behind her back or crossed to the other side of the street to avoid her. Miguel and Caleb treated her with respect, taking their cues from Preston's easy manner with her. One evening, as December's darkness fell early, Tabitha finished preparing supper while Preston sat at the kitchen table, going over his ledgers. "You're good with numbers," she observed, noticing his neat columns of figures. He glanced up with a smile. "Had to be. Cattle buyers will cheat you blind if you can't add faster than they can talk." "My father would have appreciated that. He was a banker." Preston's pencil paused. It was the first time she'd mentioned her family. "Is that why you're so good at managing my household accounts?" She nodded. "He taught me bookkeeping. Thought it would make me a suitable wife for a businessman someday. Instead, you're keeping a cowboy's accounts straight." Preston's tone was light, but his eyes were thoughtful. "Seems like a waste of your education." "I'm grateful for the work," she said simply. Later, as they ate supper together after the ranch hands had retired to the bunkhouse, Preston asked, "Do you miss your family?" Tabitha set down her fork. "Every day, but they made their choice. Without hearing your side, they heard what they wanted to hear, that I'd been caught with a man, that I'd disgraced them." Her voice remained steady, though the pain was still raw. "They didn't want to hear that he'd promised marriage, that he'd said all the things a naive girl wants to hear." Preston's jaw tightened. "And then he left. The next morning, with my virtue and my family's savings." She gave a hollow laugh. "When I tried to explain, my father called me a liar as well as a whore, said no daughter of his would be so foolish." "He was wrong," Preston said quietly, "about all of it." Something in his voice made Tabitha look up. The intensity in his blue eyes stole her breath. "The world's full of men who make promises they don't intend to keep," Preston continued, "and women who believe them because they want to. That doesn't make either of them bad people. Just human. The town doesn't see it that way. Then the town is wrong too." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "You're not what they call you, Tabitha." For the first time since the scandal, Tabitha felt tears forming. She blinked them back, unwilling to show such weakness. "Thank you for saying that." His hand remained on hers, warm and strong. "I'm not just saying it. I'm seeing it. Every day." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Tabitha gently withdrew her hand. "It's getting late. I should head back before the snow gets worse." Preston frowned at the window, where fat snowflakes swirled in the darkness. "You can't ride back in this. The temperature's dropping fast." "I'll be fine. It's only 5 miles." 5 miles of open country in a snowstorm. He shook his head firmly. "You'll stay in the spare room tonight. No arguments." The spare room was small but comfortable. With a patchwork quilt and a small wood stove that Preston lit for her. As he wished her good night and closed the door, Tabitha sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the strange turn her life had taken. For months she'd been alone, scorned, surviving on the edges of a society that had rejected her. Now she was in Preston Grayson's home, treated with kindness and respect she'd thought lost to her forever. She didn't dare name the feeling growing in her heart. It was too fragile, too impossible. The blizzard that began that night raged for 3 days, forcing Tabitha to remain at the ranch. She filled her days with cooking, baking, and mending Preston's clothes. In the evenings, they sat by the fire while he told stories of his cattle-driving days or read aloud from one of the books he kept carefully shelved against the wall. On the third night, the wind finally died down, leaving an eerie stillness outside. Preston added another log to the fire, while Tabitha worked on darning a sock. "Storm's breaking," he said, settling back in his chair. "You'll be able to head home tomorrow." Tabitha nodded, ignoring the unexpected pang his words caused. "I've imposed on your hospitality too long already." "It's not an imposition, it's been—" He searched for the right word. "Pleasant, having you here." She smiled, though her heart ached. It has been nice to be treated as something other than a pariah. Preston watched her for a long moment. "You know, my offer still stands. There's plenty of work here year-round. You wouldn't have to ride back and forth in the snow. Are you offering me a permanent position?" "I'm offering you a place where you're respected." His voice was low, intent. "Where no one judges you for a mistake that wasn't even yours to begin with." Tabitha's fingers stilled on her mending. The town would talk. Let them. They'd say I'm your— She couldn't finish the sentence. "They called you a fallen woman long before you ever met me," Preston said gently. "Will it really be worse if they think you've found someone who cares for you?" Her heart stuttered at his words. "Do you care for me?" Preston rose from his chair and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Tabitha Lawson, I've cared for you since the day you stood in Simmons's store with your head high despite the whispers. I've admired your courage, your dignity, and your refusal to be broken by people who aren't fit to judge you." Tears welled in her eyes. "Preston, you don't know what you're saying. Your reputation." "Hang my reputation," he said fiercely. "I've watched you these past weeks, seen your strength, your kindness, your intelligence. I know exactly what I'm saying." Before she could respond, he continued, "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. Just stay. Work here if that's what you want, but know that you have a place here, not as a servant or an employee, but as a woman I deeply respect." Tabitha's tears spilled over. "Why would you do this for me?" "Because everyone deserves a second chance, and because—" His voice softened. "Because I'm falling in love with you, Tabitha. Heaven help me, but I am." The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Tabitha stared at him, searching for any sign of deception or pity. She found only sincerity in his clear blue eyes. "The town will never accept me," she whispered. "They'll turn against you, too." "Then we'll make our own way," Preston answered. "This ranch is just the beginning. I've got plans, Tabitha. Dreams big enough for two if you want to share them." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting golden light across his earnest face. Outside, the world was buried in snow, silent and clean. A new beginning. "I can't ask you to sacrifice everything for me," Tabitha said. Preston's smile was gentle. "You're not asking, I'm offering. There's a difference." In that moment, looking into his eyes, Tabitha allowed herself to hope again, to believe that perhaps her story wasn't finished after all. "I need time," she finally said. "This is unexpected." He nodded, rising to his feet. "Take all the time you need. My feelings won't change." The next morning, Preston drove Tabitha back to her cabin in his sleigh. The world sparkled with fresh snow, untouched and perfect. At her door, he helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist. "Think about what I said," he murmured. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. As he turned to leave, Tabitha called out, "Preston!" He looked back, hope written plainly on his face. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing me, the real me." His smile warmed her more than any fire could. That's the only Tabitha worth seeing. Spring came early to Montana that year. The snow melted, revealing tender green shoots beneath. Tabitha continued working at Preston's ranch 3 days a week, but something had shifted between them. Gentle touches, lingering glances, conversations that stretched late into the evening, a slow, careful courtship that respected her past and looked toward their future. The town's gossip hadn't stopped. If anything, it had intensified when Preston began escorting Tabitha to church each Sunday, sitting proudly beside her despite the whispers and stares. "They called her a fallen woman," Mrs. Holloway had hissed loud enough for Tabitha to hear one Sunday. Preston had overheard too. Rising to his feet in the middle of the congregation, he'd turned to face the whispers. "Then I'll fall with her," he'd declared, his voice ringing through the church. "And I'll consider myself blessed to do so." That day marked a turning point. While some townsfolk continued to shun Tabitha, others, moved by Preston's devotion, began to soften. Mrs. Kincaid from the boarding house brought a basket of preserves to Tabitha's cabin. Mr. Simmons started greeting her politely when she entered his store. Small gestures that began to heal old wounds. On a warm June evening, Preston took Tabitha riding to a hillside overlooking his ranch. Wildflowers carpeted the ground, painting the landscape in brilliant colors. "Remember when I said I had dreams big enough for two?" Preston asked as they sat side by side on a blanket. Tabitha nodded. The memory of that night by the fire had sustained her through many lonely evenings. "I've been working on them," he continued. "Got the bank loan approved last week. By next spring we'll have the finest horse breeding operation in the territory." "We?" Tabitha asked softly. Preston turned to face her fully. "If you want it to be we," he took her hands in his. "Tabitha Lawson, I've loved you since before I knew what love truly meant. I love your strength, your dignity, your heart. Will you marry me? Make this ranch our home, these dreams our future." Tears blurred Tabitha's vision. "The town can either accept us or go to blazes," Preston said firmly. "I don't care what they think. I only care what you think." Looking into his eyes, Tabitha saw everything she'd thought forever lost to her: respect, acceptance, love, a future not defined by one mistake, but by countless choices they would make together. "Yes," she whispered, "yes, I'll marry you." They were married on a crisp September day, with golden aspen leaves falling around them like nature's blessing. Few from town attended, but Miguel and Caleb stood proudly as witnesses, and to Tabitha's surprise, Sheriff Wilson came, bringing a wedding gift and an awkward but sincere apology. "Your father would be proud if he had any sense," the old lawman told her. "You've shown more character than most in this town, myself included." As Preston slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, he repeated the words that had changed everything. "They called you fallen. I'm honored to fall with you every day for the rest of our lives. That night, as they stood on the porch of what was now their home, watching stars appear in the vast Montana sky, Tabitha felt the last of her shame finally release its hold. "What are you thinking?" Preston asked, his arms wrapped around her from behind. "That falling isn't so terrible when someone catches you," she answered, turning in his embrace to kiss him. 5 years later, the Grayson Ranch had grown into one of the most successful operations in the territory. Their Morgan horses were sought after throughout the West, and their home had expanded to accommodate their growing family. 3-year-old Elizabeth and 1-year-old James toddled through rooms once silent and empty. Tabitha stood on the porch, watching Preston teaching Elizabeth to ride her pony in the corral. The little girl's laughter floated on the summer breeze, pure and joyful. The sound of a carriage approaching drew her attention. As it came closer, Tabitha's breath caught in her throat. She would recognize that elegant vehicle anywhere it belonged to her father. Thomas Lawson stepped down from the carriage, older and grayer than when she'd last seen him 5 years ago. He stood uncertainly at the gate, his banker's hat clutched in his hands. Preston, noticing the visitor, lifted Elizabeth from the pony and hurried to Tabitha's side, his arm going protectively around her waist. "It's my father," she whispered, hardly believing her eyes. "Do you want to see him?" Preston asked, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to." Tabitha took a deep breath, drawing strength from Preston's presence and from the life they'd built together. "Yes, I do." They walked together to meet Thomas Lawson, with Elizabeth skipping ahead, oblivious to the tension. "Tabitha," her father said, his voice rough with emotion, you look well." "I am well," she replied, feeling Preston's steadying hand at the small of her back. Thomas glanced at the thriving ranch, at Preston, at little Elizabeth, who now hid shyly behind her mother's skirts. "I hear you've made quite a success here." "We have," Preston answered, extending his hand. "Preston Grayson, your daughter's husband." Thomas shook his hand, then looked back at Tabitha. "The bank in Helena is closing its doors. I'm not as secure as I once was." Tabitha understood what it cost this proud man to admit his circumstances had changed. "I'm sorry to hear that." An awkward silence fell until Thomas cleared his throat. "I received a letter from Sheriff Wilson. He told me about your life here, about your children." His eyes lingered on Elizabeth. "My grandchildren." "Why are you here, Father?" Tabitha asked directly. Thomas Lawson's weathered face crumpled. "To ask your forgiveness. I was wrong, Tabitha, so terribly wrong. Pride and reputation meant more to me than my own daughter, and I've regretted it every day since." Tears stung Tabitha's eyes. "It's been 5 years." 5 years too long," he acknowledged. "I don't expect you to welcome me with open arms. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry, and that I'm proud of what you've built here, despite everything, despite me." Preston's arm tightened around Tabitha's waist. She leaned into his strength, remembering his words from long ago. Everyone deserves a second chance. "Would you like to stay for supper?" she asked finally. "Meet your grandson? He's just inside with the nanny." Relief and hope transformed her father's face. "I would like that very much." As they walked toward the house, Elizabeth overcame her shyness and slipped her small hand into her grandfather's. The old man looked down at her in wonder, then up at Tabitha with tears in his eyes. Preston hung back slightly, giving Tabitha a moment alone with her father. She turned to him, her heart full of gratitude for this man who had taught her that falling wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. "Thank you," she mouthed silently to her husband. Preston smiled, the same smile that had warmed her heart that day in the general store so long ago. "For what?" he asked softly. "For falling with me," she replied, "for catching me." "Always," he promised, taking her hand as they walked together into the home they had built, proof that sometimes what the world calls fallen is simply waiting to be lifted up by love.